It's October the 8th, 1594. We're on the banks of the Kamo River in Kyoto, Japan. Ishikawa Goemon, a bandit, outlaw, and to some, folk hero, has had his last adventure. Now he is condemned to die, along with his sworn comrades, and even his young son. Ishikawa shivers, not because of the season. The last of the summer warmth still lingers in Kyoto, winter not yet on its way. Instead, he shudders because of what he sees before him. Vast cauldrons, each large enough to completely submerge a man, and all filled with boiling oil. His captors go through the motions. Goemon's sentence is read out, and he's hurled into the roiling, scalding oil. Along with him, Goemon's son is tossed into the pot. As the wicked agony of the oil overtakes him, Goemon's skin is slowed from his bones. Thrashing desperately in the vicious, cloying liquid, he makes one final attempt to save his son. Planting his feet firmly upon the burning hot base of the pot, he rises to his full height and lifts his son aloft, out of the oil. The story grows hazy here, years of popular myth and legend melding to create their own truth. Some say Goemon's final act of defiance affected his enemies, moving them to pardon the horrifically scolded, but still very much alive youngster. Others say Goemon's final act was a futile one. His strength fading, he sank back into the oil, taking his son with him. In either case, Goemon died that day on the banks of the Kamo River, in the most horrific of ways, and entered Japanese folklore as a result. Goemon's end is particularly evocative and astonishingly cruel, but it's not unique. It's a pattern we've seen time and time again in human history, the powers that be devising cruelly innovative ways to inflict suffering. For centuries, Japan's leaders made their own contributions to the catalogue of human misery, executing their prisoners in stomach-churning, sometimes stomach-lacerating ways. This is the story of capital punishment in feudal Japan. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. Every day, you carry something that hasn't really changed in over a century. It's bulky, it's disorganized, it's easy to lose, and it's easy to steal. And that is your wallet. Exter is here to change that with a sleek, secure wallet designed for the 21st century. Instead of stuffing cards into folds of leather, Exter gives you instant access. Press a button and your cards pop up, neatly fanned and ready to use. It's fast, it's smooth, and honestly, it's kind of addictive. Made from premium materials, including aerospace-grade aluminium and substantially sourced leather, Exter wallets are also RFID blocking, so your data stays safe. And if you lose the wallet, you're not going to have to spend 20 minutes lifting up every single pillow on the sofa, because you can just digitally locate the wallet in seconds. No more bulging pockets, no more digging for the right card, no more panic when you can't find your wallet. Currently, we're having a sale. You can get up to 44% off site-wide. Head to partner.exter.com/flashbackhistory or click the link in the description and use the code FLASHBACK to unlock an extra 10% off at checkout. Don't carry the past in your pocket, carry Exter. Feudal Japan is a broad term which covers a sprawling period. In 1192, Minamoto no Yoritomo declared himself Tai Shogun, or barbarian quelling generalissimo, and began the era of the Kamakura shogunate. In 1868, Tokugawa Yoshinobu was overthrown, and the young Meiji Emperor was proclaimed ruler of Japan. Everything in between, almost 700 years, is feudal Japan, a period in which this group of islands on Asia's eastern boundaries was ruled over not by its emperor, but by a succession of warrior lords, or shogun. Traditionally, these shogun were leaders of samurai, an elite warrior class loyal to the code of Bushido, similar to medieval chivalric orders in Europe. The imperial family still existed, and the emperor still sat upon his throne in Kyoto, but the real power was held by the shogun and secured by his samurai. There were periods of peace and stability, even unity over these centuries. There were even times when the emperor held power over his fractured, quarrelsome domain. But in the main, the nobility were in charge, usually the toughest guy with the biggest army. It was survival of the strongest, and so judicial violence, both corporal and capital punishment, was common in feudal Japan. A stark contrast to Japan's earlier imperial history. Before the rise of the Kamakura shogunate in 1192, the death sentence was somewhat rare. During the Nara period, from 710 to 794, Buddhist teachings greatly influenced governance. In line with this message of peace and forgiveness, Nara Emperor Shomu is said to have ordered a stay on all executions. Later, during the Heian period, capital punishment was banned altogether. This made Japan the first territory in the known world to outlaw the death penalty. Such leniency, of course, would never last. In the final decades of the Heian period, the imperial government was feeling the pressure, and desperate to cling to power, they turned to the tried and tested brutal methods. After the failed Hogen insurrection in 1156, Emperor Go Shirakawa ordered that the rebel leader Minamoto no Tamayoshi be beheaded. The executioner, it was decreed, should be Tamayoshi's own son, Yoshitomo, who had remained loyal to the emperor. Yoshitomo refused. Another member of the Minamoto clan stepped in to do the deed, and with that, capital punishment returned to Japan. If this was meant to cement imperial power, it was only temporarily effective. 4 decades later, Tamayoshi's grandson, Yoritomo, was shogun. The imperial Heian period was over, and Japan was about to embrace capital punishment in a big way. This shift in judicial practice sort of makes sense, actually. In a world in which political assassination and armed coup d'etat are par for the course, leaders needed to secure their position. This meant making an example of anyone who might undermine that position or erode the rule of law. It's just that making an example tends to mean execution in the most hideous way possible. It's this doctrine of cruel, demonstrative punishment that brings us several hundred years later to the miserable demise of Ishikawa Goemon in a vat of boiling oil. Ishikawa is a little like a Japanese version of Robin Hood, and in more ways than one. Just like Mr. Robin Hood, Goemon has become something of a folk hero, an anti-authoritarian who stands up for the little guy, robbing the rich and giving to the poor. And, just like Robin Hood, there's a good chance that, in reality, he was simply a bandit looking to line his own pockets through violence and robbery. Either way, Goemon was accused of an attempted assassination on the daimyo, or feudal lord, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He was captured and sentenced to death. A crime this grave required a punishment to match. Goemon's end would not be quick. As we all know, he would be boiled alive. We can barely imagine what Goemon experienced in his final moments on Earth. Plunging into the boiling liquid immediately results in blinding pain right across the body as the outer layers of the skin blister and fall away, exposing the nerves beneath. The extreme heat also cooks internal organs and tissues, essentially turning them to boiled meat while the victim is still alive. If the head is submerged, the brain will be boiled too, hastening death. But if, as the story goes, Goemon raised his son aloft in his pot, his head was most likely above the level of the oil. If the victim is lucky, or at least comparatively lucky, they may go into shock, shielding them from the worst of the pain. Again, though, it seems Goemon had the presence of mind to try and save his son, so he was likely fully aware of what was going on for a disturbingly long time. There's only so much punishment the body can take. Goemon's suffering would have been over in a matter of minutes at most, but those minutes would have felt like hours to a man literally being cooked alive. A horrific deterrent for sure. But, as Goemon wrote in a poem just before his execution, The grains of pure white sand may run out, but the seeds of thieves will never run out. In other words, kill as many bandits as you want. There'll always be more to take our place. The warning did not stop Japan's feudal lords. They really did try to kill as many bandits as possible, often through beheading with a sword or an axe. And not just bandits, an astonishing number of crimes could be punished this way in feudal Japan. A farmer who made a simple complaint to their lord might have their head chopped off. Document forgers, ship's captains who fraudulently claimed a lost load, even servant guarantors who failed to make sure their charges fulfilled a contract, all could meet the same fate. But a short, sharp chop wasn't the only way to remove a head. Oda Nobunaga, daimyo and de facto leader of Japan for a period in the 16th century, favoured the nokogeribiki method of capital punishment. In English, sawing. A pit would be dug deep enough for a man to stand in. The victim was placed inside and the pit was filled in, pinning the victim within the earth. With his head now at ground level, his killers could lord their victory over him. This was, of course, humiliating enough, but it was nothing compared to the agony that would soon follow. A blade would then be drawn back and forth across the victim's neck, severing sinew, artery, and bone as their lifeblood pumped out onto the earth. So much blood loss would certainly be fatal, but nowhere near quickly enough. For much of the ordeal, the victim would still be alive and very probably conscious as the teeth of the saw worked its way through their neck. There are records of sawing taking place post-mortem too, a way for those in charge to make an example of their enemies with bodily mutilation and desecration. Although I think we can all agree that these were the lucky ones. For more serious crimes, like a commoner convicted of murdering their master, sawing would be combined with other methods of punishment designed to maximize shame and prolong suffering. The condemned individual would first be paraded around the local area on horseback in a process known as hikimawashi. Then came sarashi, binding in chains and displaying to the public. Finally, sawing the wretched victim's head painfully and slowly removed from their shoulders. And then, in a final visible flourish, the body was crucified. Crucifixion was a way to ram home the message: murder your master, and this is what you get. But crucifixion wasn't only a way of displaying a dead body, it was also used on the still living. Take this tale from a battle between the Takeda and Okudaira clans in 1575. When Tori Sunimon slipped out of the Okudaira's clan castle late on September 22nd, he knew the risk of death was high. The castle was under siege, surrounded by Takeda forces. The Okudaira understood that their only hope was to summon help, to bring their friends in the legendary Tokugawa and Oda clans to their aid. The dangerous task of raising the alarm fell to Sunimon. Sunimon reached the clan's allies, but on attempting to re-enter the Okudaira fortress on September the 24th, he was spotted by the Takeda and taken prisoner. Fortunately, the Takeda were in a merciful mood. His life would be spared, they said, if he would tell his comrades inside the castle that the game was up and that no help would be coming. Sunimon agreed, but his captors were dismayed when he changed his message at the last minute. Instead of telling them they were all alone, he yelled to his comrades that help was on the way. All they needed to do was just hold out a little longer. The Takeda would not tolerate this kind of trickery. They took Sunimon and strapped him to a cross, tearing his flesh with spears known as yari, as he hung there exposed to the elements. Sunimon's body remained on its cross for 3 days, a grim demonstration of what happened to opponents of the Takedas. Sunimon's fate was brutal, but he likely knew what was coming to him. In a martial culture dominated by codes of honour and courage, Sunimon's subterfuge was never going to go down well. In the words of historian Petra Schmidt, crimes considered most despicable were punished by crucifixion. A person who had sneaked by a roadblock or assisted such a crime was crucified, as was one who let a foundling die. Plenty of other crimes were punished by crucifixion too, to quote Petra Schmidt again. An adulterous wife who killed her husband, false accusers of their own master or parents, forgers of gold or silver coins, all ended at the cross. This would have been a miserable experience. First, the accused underwent hikimawashi, so that all could revel in the shame and defeat. Next, they were hung up on the cross. The victims weren't nailed in place, like in the biblical tradition. Instead, they were tied and lofted above the execution site for all to see. Compounding the torture, the victims were jabbed from below with spears, drawing blood from gaping wounds in their sides. Finally, a spear would be jammed through the victim's throat, bringing the release of death. If the executioners were merciful, this final stroke would come quickly. Then the body would hang for 3 days, just like Suleiman's did, a warning to anyone considering stepping out of line. Visibility was, as always, key. The medium was the message, a stark reminder of who was boss. Such was the eagerness to make a point that prisoners who died too quickly would be pickled so that they could be crucified later. Crucifixion would take different forms across Japan. Mizuharitsuki means water crucifixion. The victim was strung up on a cross on the shore at low tide, and as the water came in, it would submerge the victim up to their head as they struggled for breath against the rising tide. Victims didn't drown from this. The height of the cross was carefully calculated to extend the suffering. For several days and nights, victims were racked with hunger and thirst, the salt water driving them mad as it splashed against their parched lips. Their bodies burned in the sun and chilled in the rain until finally they expired. Sakasaritsuke meant crucifixion upside down. When he wasn't boiling bandits, daimyo Toyotomi Hideyoshi seemed to quite like this method, increasing the final agonies and delirium as blood pooled into the condemned's cranium. In the Christian tradition, upside-down crucifixion is associated with Saint Peter. Hideyoshi may have been aware of this. He may have just enjoyed the symbolism too, as quite a lot of Christians were crucified this way in an upside-down fashion. The most famous of all Japan's Christian crucifixions, however, was not conducted upside down. This was the killing of 26 people in Nagasaki in 1597. A Jesuit missionary said of the event, "The very pagans who assisted at the martyrdom was struck at seeing the joy of the blessed ones as they suffered on their crosses, and the courage with which they met death." It's unlikely that the missionary was actually present at the execution, given that he would have been a candidate for the cross himself, so we can't know quite how much joy those 26 wretched souls found in their final minutes. Other methods also reflect those used in Europe. Burning, for example, was the way many European heretics met their maker. Similar processes occurred in Japan, where victims were bound to a pillar above a pile of bamboo sticks, which were then set alight. Some methods were less common, but occasionally used. Ushizaki and kurumazaki meant being torn apart by either oxen or carts, exerting tremendous forces in opposite directions until the victim's body was ripped apart. While methods of execution were as diverse as the crimes of the accused, most shared some key aspects. They were designed to inflict maximum pain and maximum humiliation. But this led to a problem: the samurai. In Japan's far from equal society, samurai were considered a class above the regular peasantry. They could even mete out their own capital punishments. Kirisute Gomen, or the right to strike, meant samurai were permitted to cut the body of anyone they deemed to deserve it, typically leaving them to die, provided they followed strict rules in doing so. But though elite, samurai could still be sentenced to death. It wasn't the pain that was the issue for samurai. The chance to show resilience in the face of extreme suffering was actually welcomed under the Bushido Code. It was the humiliation, the loss of honor that was the problem. And to be killed by a lowly common executioner for a samurai was unacceptable. But this conundrum did have a solution. When writer Yukio Mishima and 4 associates visited the Ichigaya military camp in Tokyo, they had an agenda in mind. Taking the commander hostage, Mishima stepped onto a balcony to deliver his message to the soldiers amassed below him. "We have watched with gritted teeth as the shame of defeat has been ducked and avoided rather than wiped away, and as the Japanese themselves sully their own history and traditions." But this was not the 17th century, this was 1970. Mishima was not addressing a group of feudal samurai warriors, but instead the modern Japanese defense forces. Mishima's aim was a coup d'etat that would bring Japan back to its old ways, the traditional honor and valor which, in his view, had been lost. But the soldiers found Mashida's chiding insulting and annoying. They jeered him, forcing him back inside. What happened next was a bloody mess. The humiliated Mishima produced a sword and plunged it into his own abdomen, drawing it painfully across his stomach as blood and viscera poured from him onto the office floor. One of Mishima's accomplices, a man named Morita, acted as his second, or kaishakunin. Morita's job was to put an end to Mishima's misery by cutting off his head. Morita failed, and so a third man named Koga stepped in to finish the job. Morita now turned the blade on himself, tearing a great wound into his own stomach, spilling his intestines out onto a floor already awash with gore. Koga then stepped in again, cutting off his second head of the day and bringing the bizarre bloodshed to its conclusion. An arch-traditionalist, Mishima had ended his own life with seppuku, ritual suicide which allowed a samurai to regain lost honor, atone for certain crimes, or avoid disgrace following a defeat. The first recorded cases emerged in the 12th century when the practice was referred to as harakiri, or stomach cutting. It was not until the 15th century that the concept of seppuku first appeared, a formalized process of harakiri performed according to strict rules and customs. But seppuku wasn't just a method of suicide, it was also a form of capital punishment too, and for a samurai it was the only acceptable option. Perhaps the most famous example of this took place in 1703 when Samurai Oishi Yoshio and 46 others were sentenced to death for the assassination of the daimyo Kira Yoshinaka, avenging the killing of their own leader Asano Naganori 2 years earlier. They were instructed to honourably disembowel themselves, which 46 of them did on March 30th. The remaining man, Terasaka Kichiemon, received a pardon. Oishi and his comrades were samurai without a master, or ronin, and the story of the 47 ronin has resonated throughout Japanese history. However, forced seppuku was outlawed in 1873, but the practice has re-emerged several times in Japanese history since then. On the day of the Meiji Emperor's funeral in 1912, General Nogi Marisuke and his wife Shizuku ended their lives this way. In World War II, a number of defeated military commanders did the same. A study from the early 2000s found that 0.2% of suicide cases in Japan was still carried out in a manner similar to harakiri or seppuku. But brutal capital punishment is not unique to feudal Japan. In 1531, 6 decades before Ishikara Goemon met his hideous end, a man named Richard Roos was put to death in a very similar way by Henry VIII for the supposed crime of poisoning. Roos was repeatedly dipped into boiling liquid, prolonging his agony for 2 hours. I've actually done a video on this if you want to take a look once you're done with this one. And in 1757, on the Place de Grève in Paris, Robert François Damiens was executed in flagrant style for the attempted assassination on Louis XV. Damiens' genitals were cut off and his 4 limbs were tied to horses, which slowly and agonizingly dismembered him. His torso was then burned at the stake, and some accounts claim he was still alive as the flames claimed him. That, by the way, is the half of his execution. It just goes on and on and on. The grotesque display, in the end, was futile. Just as the execution of Minamoto no Tamayoshi in 1156 had not prevented the fall of the empire, the French monarchy was overthrown several decades later. The same executioner who had overseen Damiens' miserable end would go on to execute Louis's grandson, Louis XVI. Perhaps this endless cycle of violent power struggle troubled the Meiji Emperor after the restoration of the imperial power in 1868. 3 years later, he introduced a major reform to the penal code. Bizarre and elaborate methods of execution were outlawed, as was torture and flogging. Capital punishments became reserved for only the most serious of crimes. This was likely a smart move. For almost 700 years of feudal rule, Japanese justice had drawn on some of the most brutal methods imaginable. No one was in any doubt about what happened to those who stepped out of line. And yet, the rebellions, civil wars, and assassinations just kept coming. Violence, it seems, is not always a means to peace. Just like Gorman told us in his death poem, there will always be more bandits, there'll always be more people looking to overthrow tyrannical overlords. The Meiji Emperor was out to create a new Japan, more outward-facing, better equipped to deal with modern diplomacy and geopolitics, and this meant leaving the feudal era behind and reforming capital punishment. As to whether the Meiji Emperor actually succeeded in his aims to make Japan a benevolent, outward-looking and progressive state, that's definitely a story for another time.